When Jasmine Crockett took the stage beside Ilhan Omar, no one expected what would follow. One tear, 6 words, and 14 million views later, the silence that haunted generations was broken. On a talk show titled What They Never Told You About Power, Jasmine shared a story from one Texas night that no politician had dared to speak. Ilhan, scarred by years of betrayal, broke down, not from weakness, but because someone finally voiced what she'd buried for a decade. So what exactly did Jasmine say that made the world stop and brought Ilhan Omar to tears? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The cameras hadn't started rolling yet, but the tension in Studio 9 was already humming beneath the soft jazz music playing overhead. The set of unfiltered voices was deliberately understated. Velvet armchairs in deep indigo, a table of hand-poured tea between them, and warm amber lights glowing like a sunset frozen in time. But the mood wasn't warm. Not tonight. This wasn't a night for comfort. It was a night for truth with no apology. On one side sat Ilhan Omar, spine straight, fingers locked, eyes alert beneath lashes trained by years of political warfare. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, posture relaxed but aura electric, like a thunderstorm pretending to be calm. The producers knew this wasn't just any episode. It was the first time these two firebrands would share the same frame, and the subject? What They Never Told You About Power, a title that promised blood, if not tears. As the director counted down, 5, 4, 3, there was a beat, almost imperceptible, where everything stood still. Then the lights snapped hotter, the music faded, and the host, Vanessa Hill, leaned forward with a voice too smooth for the storm she was about to unleash. Let's talk about what power costs you when you look like them. Her hand gestured, not gently, to Ilhan and Jasmine. The studio audience, a rare mix of students, activists, and reporters, leaned in as if holding their breath. Ilhan's face didn't move, but her jaw tightened. Jasmine cocked her head slightly, as if preparing for war with a smile. No teleprompter could save them tonight. This wasn't about policy points or polling numbers. This was about what had been stolen and what they dared to take back. And as the first question sliced through the air, the real show began. Not of politics, but of survival. And just as the tension from Jasmine's story began to settle into silence, the host pivoted, her voice low, deliberate, almost reverent. Congresswoman Omar, may I ask, when the world turns your words against you, what does survival look like? The lights seemed to dim, not physically, but emotionally, as if the room itself braced for what was coming. Ilhan didn't answer right away. She inhaled slowly, eyes locked on the floor for a brief second, not in shame, but in memory. When she finally spoke, it was with the precise control of someone who has had to weaponize their own voice just to be heard. It was a Thursday, she began, a regular meeting, a town hall. I was speaking about the dangers of isolation, how extremism festers where people feel invisible, unheard. I referenced a question someone had asked me. I repeated it. Some terrorist groups claim to have legitimate grievances, and then I refuted it. Right there. Strongly, unequivocally. Her voice did not waver. But someone decided to slice that moment, cut out the context, rip out the rejection. All that remained was the infection. My voice, saying words I never believed. She blinked once, slowly, as if reliving the moment the clip went viral. And within hours, I wasn't a representative anymore. I was a threat, a target, a caricature. People I'd worked beside for years didn't call, didn't ask. They forwarded statements to press secretaries and vanished into silence. Her jaw tightened. Her hands were still, but her presence was thunder. They didn't just smear me, she continued. They unstitched my citizenship, thread by thread, as if the oath I took meant less because of my scarf, or my accent, or my skin. She turned her head slightly, locking eyes with no one, and yet everyone. The death threats weren't the worst part. The worst part was walking into chambers with people who knew me, who knew better, and watching them pretend neutrality was courage. Then came the line that held the room hostage. I wasn't abandoned by enemies. I was abandoned by silence. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her pain wasn't in her tears. It was in her restraint, in the way her voice stayed level, even as her truth flayed the air open. This wasn't just recollection. It was revelation. She wasn't recounting an event. She was indicting a system. And in that breathless studio, under the illusion of calm amber lights, Ilhan Omar did not ask for pity. She asked for reckoning. And as Ilhan's words dissolved into the charged stillness, not a single soul in the room dared to move. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for respect. It commanded it. The camera, almost reluctantly, shifted its gaze to Jasmine Crockett. No words, no gestures, just a slow pan to a woman sitting not across from Ilhan, but beside her in spirit. Jasmine didn't speak, didn't lean forward for dramatic effect. She simply looked. And in that look was fire without flames, grief without tears, rage without noise. Her eyes were unflinching, locked on Ilhan not like a politician watching a peer, but like a soldier watching another survivor recount the ambush. Her lips didn't tremble, her face didn't soften, but something in her shifted, subtly, visibly, like steel flexing under heat. And then came the nod. Not a courteous tilt, not a diplomatic cue for applause. This was a silent oath, sealed in the space between breath and bone. A nod that said, "I've been betrayed too. I know what silence tastes like, and I didn't come here to perform. I came to stand." The moment that followed wasn't filled with commentary or filler. It was thick with something deeper, heavier. The atmosphere between them was not confrontational, nor sympathetic. It was compressed, tense, but sacred, like two tectonic plates meeting beneath the surface, unspoken histories grinding into alignment. Jasmine's posture remained unchanged, but her presence expanded, claiming space not with volume, but with truth unspoken. You could almost feel the vibration in the floorboards, as if the very studio recognized that what was happening was no longer television. This was something raw, older, a silent reckoning between two women who had learned, through wounds and whispers, that being heard was a privilege they had to carve out of stone. Jasmine didn't break the silence with words. She broke it with witness. And in that quiet rupture, Ilhan wasn't alone anymore. There were no lights bright enough to capture what passed between them, but every woman who'd ever been gaslit, sidelined, or erased felt it. And just when the studio seemed to hold its final breath, when the memory between two women had finished echoing through the silence, Vanessa leaned in once more, this time with eyes sharp and tone almost reverent. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice low like the turning of a key, "have you ever stood alone?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She didn't blink. Her expression shifted, barely. But for those who knew the language of trauma, it was unmistakable. It was the kind of stillness that comes before thunder. She turned slightly toward the audience, but not for show. She turned because what she was about to say couldn't be spoken straight into the air. It had to be spoken through it. "It was a night in July," she began, voice steady, quiet, not soft. "Summer in Texas is thick, the kind of heat that crawls under your collar and makes your skin feel like it's trying to escape your body. I remember because I had just finished court, a late arraignment, a juvenile case that didn't sit right with me. My phone buzzed while I was halfway to the parking lot. It was a mother, shaking so hard on the call I could barely understand her. Her son, 17, black, soft-spoken, barely 5'7", had just been tackled outside a corner store. No gun, no stolen goods. Just a hoodie, a backpack, and skin the color police protocols were built to fear. She inhaled slowly, eyes unfocused now, not lost, but accessing something exact. "They said he fit a description, that's all. No details, no victim, no report. Just a body on the sidewalk in handcuffs that clicked like a sentence already written." Jasmine's jaw set. "I drove straight to the station, still in my heels, still in my suit. I asked to see him. They told me no. I asked again, showed my badge, my license, cited the code. They laughed. 'You're not his lawyer of record,' they said. 'You can wait outside.' Her eyes lifted now, straight into the lens, unflinching. So I did. I waited 6 hours in the thick heat, alone. I stood under the street lamp, phone in one hand, live stream on in the other. No ring light, no script, just me, a sidewalk, and a voice I refused to mute. I narrated everything, every officer who walked in, every hour they refused to provide paperwork, every lie they tried to wrap in bureaucratic language. The video caught fire. People started sharing, watching, commenting, and still, no one came. No attorney, no activist, no elected official, just me and a boy behind a wall. She leaned forward slightly, the weight in her voice sharpening like the draw of a blade. Around hour 4, my inbox filled with warnings, friends telling me I was making the department angry, colleagues texting me things like, "This isn't smart, and you're risking your career." Then came the calls, blocked numbers, distorted voices. "You don't want to make enemies, Ms. Crockett. You sure you want to be the face of this?" As if I had chosen it, as if silence was ever a real option. She paused and the room sat still, breathless. At hour 5, a car rolled up slow behind me, tinted windows, engine idling like it had something to say. It didn't stop, just circled, twice. I remember gripping my phone tighter, not out of fear, but out of fury, because I realized in that moment, if anything happened to me, there would be no arrest, no footage, no headlines, just another headline that never made it. Her voice dipped, lower, heavier, but never trembling. Then in hour 6, a local reporter showed up. She had seen the stream. She brought a cameraman. Within minutes, a supervisor inside the station came out, suddenly very polite. "There's been a clerical error," he said. "He's being released." Just like that. No explanation, no apology, no accountability. That boy walked out with his shoelaces still missing and eyes so wide it looked like he hadn't blinked in hours. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. That night didn't make me brave. It made me angry because the system didn't fail. It worked exactly as it was built. It took 6 hours, 2,000 viewers, and a goddamn news camera to release a child who hadn't done a thing wrong. That's not justice. That's public relations under duress. She looked directly at Vanessa now. And yes, I paid a price. The next morning, I got called into the office. I was told my actions were unprofessional, that I had embarrassed the district. I was warned. I was threatened. One senior attorney even told me, "You'll never make it in this game with stunts like that." And I remember looking at him and thinking, if this is the game, I don't want to play. I want to break the damn board. A hush swept the studio, not emptiness, but reverence. Jasmine sat back finally and folded her hands. Not as surrender, but as punctuation. "That night wasn't the first time I saw injustice," she said, voice low now, almost intimate. "But it was the first time I realized I couldn't keep patching the wounds. I had to fight the knife." She let the words hang there, heavy, real, undeniable. And in that moment, under lights that no longer felt stage, on a stage that had become sacred, Jasmine Crockett wasn't a politician. She wasn't a guest. She was a reckoning made flesh. And every person watching knew. The line between witness and warrior is one step, and she had taken it, alone, unflinching, and uninvited. And when Jasmine's final words about that long night in Dallas began to dissipate into the breathless stillness of the studio, Vanessa leaned in once more. This time, not as a host, but as a human being reaching through the fog of memory. Her voice was quieter now, almost fragile in the wake of what had just been shared, as if it too were treading carefully across the ashes of something sacred. "But were you afraid?" The question cut cleanly, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't rhetorical. It was raw. For a full 3 seconds, Jasmine didn't respond. Her face didn't shift. Her body didn't flinch. But something in her eyes, something deep, coiled, forged, tightened. She didn't blink, didn't perform. She just sat in the weight of the question like a woman who had carried it before. And then, In a tone so steady it felt carved from the very moment she was about to recall, she answered, "Of course I was afraid," she said. The words weren't defensive. They weren't even brave. They were undeniable. You don't stand in front of a police station at midnight knowing damn well that you're being watched by men with badges and power and permission and not feel fear. Her voice didn't rise. It sank, slow and deliberate, like a confession pulled from the bottom of a well. The air was thick with it. Fear in every breath. Fear in the way I turned my back to the parking lot. Fear in the headlights that didn't turn off even when the engine did. She drew in a slow breath, not for drama, but like someone remembering how her lungs worked in the moment she almost forgot. It wasn't the kind of fear that makes you run. It was the kind that roots you in place and dares you to move anyway. My phone felt like a weapon. Every word I said into that live stream, I said wondering if it would be the last thing people heard from me. But I kept going. Not because I wasn't scared, but because I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't. Now she leaned forward, hands clasped between her knees, not to ground herself, but to anchor the truth about to follow. If I didn't stand there, if I didn't shine a light on that door and force the world to see it, then what would have happened to that boy? Her voice cracked, not with emotion, but with the pressure of holding too much clarity inside too long. He would have disappeared, not legally, not with fanfare, just gone, buried in paperwork, mislabeled as dangerous, reduced to a mugshot and a lie. And I would have known, I would have carried it, that I let silence finish what injustice started. She looked up now, eyes burning, not with tears, but with precision. "So yeah," she said again, more softly, more deadly. "I was afraid, but silence kills more than fear ever will. And if I didn't stand there that night, then someone else, some kid, some mother's son, would have been devoured by the same machine that almost took him. They would have vanished, and I would have watched it happen, from the safety of my own career. And that," she exhaled sharply, "that is not safety. That is complicity in a nicer suit." The audience didn't move. Even the camera operators seemed to have stopped breathing. Jasmine's next words came with the weight of someone who wasn't just answering a question, but confronting a system that punished truth and rewarded silence. "That night taught me something I can't unlearn," she said. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do with your fear when no one's watching, when the headlines haven't started and the cameras haven't come, and it's just you and the sound of your own heartbeat and a door that won't open." She paused again, not to compose herself, but to let the silence digest her truth. "I stood there because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't, and I haven't regretted that night for a single second. But what still haunts me, what I still carry, is that I was alone." Her fingers curled into her palms, not shaking, but locked in quiet fury. "And the fact that standing up against injustice requires risking everything you've earned says everything about the kind of country we're still living in." And then came the final blow. Not a shout, not a chant, but a single sentence delivered with such quiet precision it felt like a scalpel slicing open the very walls of the studio. "If I didn't stand there, who would be next to be swallowed whole by silence?" There was no response, no reaction, just stunned stillness. But in that stillness, something irreversible happened. And as Jasmine's final sentence echoed across the studio like a slow blade slicing through silence, "If I didn't stand there, who would be next to be swallowed whole by silence?" The room felt as if it had been carved open. Not a whisper stirred. Not even the soft hum of the studio lights could cut through the stillness now. The audience didn't breathe. The cameras kept rolling, but even the lenses seemed to pause, uncertain whether what was unfolding still belonged on a screen or had crossed into something more sacred. Ilhan Omar sat motionless. Her posture hadn't changed since the start of the show. Poised, disciplined, balanced like a sculpture sculpted from resolve. But now there was something unsteady, barely visible, but undeniable. Her hands remained folded in her lap, but her eyes were no longer locked on the host or the crowd. They were fixed on Jasmine, not just looking, but seeing. Something inside her cracked, not loudly, not violently, but like a splinter deep in the foundation of something long thought unshakable. She turned her face slightly, not enough to escape the camera, but enough to make clear that something inside had shifted. Her gaze dropped, not in shame, but in revelation. And then it happened. The kind of moment no script can write and no audience can prepare for. A tear, not many, not dramatic, just one. A single silvered thread slipping down the edge of her cheek. She didn't wipe it away right away. She let it fall. She let it exist. Not as surrender, but as testimony. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, not because it was weak, but because it was real. As if anything louder would break the moment's fragile truth. "No one has ever said it like that," she murmured. Her eyes didn't move from Jasmine's. "Not like you just did." And in those few words, the air shifted again. Not with applause, not with commentary, but with a kind of silent, collective exhale. The audience hadn't expected Ilhan Omar, the unshakable, unflinching, always strategic congresswoman, to break. And yet here she was, not broken, but opened, reclaimed. She paused, letting the silence stretch, not for effect, but for space. "I've carried so much, for so long," she said finally, the words dragging up from somewhere deep and guarded. Not just the attacks, not just the headlines, but the silence. The awful, cavernous silence that came after. The silence from people who knew the truth but said nothing. People who watched me get torn apart piece by piece and chose comfort over courage. Her voice didn't tremble, but it carried weight, thick as grief, sharp as memory. And in the middle of all that, I trained myself to survive by hardening, by burying things too fragile to protect. She finally reached up and wiped her cheek. Not quickly, not dismissively. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as if reclaiming even that act, the right to weep without apology. "Somewhere along the way," she continued, "I convinced myself that fear had no place in what I do, that to survive this work, I had to strip it away, hide it so deep even I forgot it was there. Because if I showed it, if I so much as let it flicker in my voice, they'd seize it, they'd twist it into proof. Proof that I didn't belong. Proof that I was too emotional, too volatile, too fragile for rooms built to contain power that was never designed for women like me. The truth of it, too long buried, now hung in the air, unmovable. I wrapped myself in armor made of rage," she confessed. "It was clean. It was sharp. It didn't beg. It didn't tremble. It let me survive debates where people questioned my loyalty to the country I risked everything to serve. It let me stand in hearings where my faith was mocked and my humanity dissected. But rage doesn't hold you when the cameras turn off. Rage doesn't help you sleep when the threats keep coming. Rage can't carry you when silence eats at your soul." Her voice dropped again, barely audible, but every syllable landed like a heartbeat amplified under a stethoscope. "You reminded me tonight," she said, eyes still locked with Jasmine's, "that fear is not failure. Fear is evidence that we still care, that we still feel, that we haven't let them hollow us out completely." She took another breath, sharp, ragged, necessary. "I forgot that. I forgot that fear is not something to erase. It's something to stand on. And you didn't just say it. You embodied it. You stood in it. You let it live. And in doing so, you gave it back to the rest of us." And in that moment, Ilhan Omar, warrior, target, symbol, was no longer speaking for the cameras, the headlines, or even the audience. She was speaking to one woman across one moment as one survivor to another. And for the first time in years, the weight she carried didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like something she could finally begin to share. Not in shame, not in secrecy, but in solidarity. A single tear, a single sentence, and a silence that didn't erase, but healed. That was all it took, and that was everything. And as the final echoes of Ilhan's voice faded into the stillness, as if the very walls of the studio needed a moment to breathe, the host gave a soft nod to the control booth. The wrap signal came down. The cameras cut. The lights dimmed. Applause, muted, stunned, reverent, swept through the audience, but even that felt distant, like noise from another world. One by one, spectators filed out in silence, their expressions carved with something heavier than admiration. No music played them out. No stagehand rushed in with pleasantries. Just a slow, respectful quiet. And in the center of it all, beneath the fading glow of forgotten spotlights, Ilhan and Jasmine remained seated. Neither woman moved. Neither woman stood. Not yet. The studio was nearly empty now. No producers buzzing around, no cameras tracking their every breath. The illusion was stripped away. No teleprompters, no cue cards, no soft-focus lenses to catch tears just right. What remained were two women of color, alone in a room that had just held the weight of their truths, and now echoed with everything left unsaid. Ilhan sat with her hands loosely clasped, still staring at the table as if trying to steady the emotional tremors that followed everything she had just opened up. Jasmine, beside her, leaned back, not in relief, but in stillness. They didn't speak immediately. They didn't need to. What had passed between them didn't require translation. It wasn't politics anymore. It was memory. It was scar tissue. It was recognition. Then, without a word, Jasmine reached into her purse. Her movements were slow, intentional, like someone retrieving something sacred, not just stored, but guarded. From a leather sleeve tucked deep inside, she pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, its edges frayed, the ink faded into the color of time. She unfolded it carefully, as if afraid the decades might crumble it in her hands. The gesture caught Ilhan's eye. Her head turned just slightly. No curiosity, just quiet attention. Jasmine placed the paper between them. Her voice when she finally spoke wasn't public. It wasn't performative. It was the voice of someone peeling back a layer they hadn't touched in years. "My mother wrote this to me," she said, "the night before I argued my first case in front of a judge who wouldn't look me in the eye." Her fingers hovered above the words, not pointing, but remembering. "She died 2 weeks later. I kept this ever since." Ilhan leaned in, not out of etiquette, but because something told her this wasn't just a note. It was a survival weapon passed down. And there it was, 7 words written in slanted cursive, worn but still defiant. "Speak when your voice shakes. That's when it matters most." Ilhan read it again, then again, and with each pass, something behind her ribs seemed to shift. Something long buried beneath armor and headlines and assassination threats. She didn't speak. She just nodded. Once. A nod that held 30 years of exile, resistance, press briefings, and quiet tears swallowed behind closed office doors. A nod that said, "That's the truth no one puts in books." Jasmine let the silence sit. She didn't explain it. She didn't interpret it. She just let it live. Between them, beside them, inside them. A relic of another woman's fire, now passed from trembling hand to trembling heart. And in that quiet, with no audience left to impress, the stage became a confessional. And the confessional became a bond. Not of party or platform or purpose, but of something harder to name. Shared resistance through uninvited womanhood. They didn't speak again for a while. They didn't need to, because in that moment, they weren't just public figures. They were daughters of women who were never allowed to scream, now daring to speak even when their voices shook. And that was the legacy they would carry, not in press releases or podiums, but in the kind of silence that finally had a voice. And for a long time after the paper was placed between them, neither woman said a word. The stage lights had long since cooled. The clatter of cleanup in the wings faded into a hollow hum. Even the studio's hollow echo seemed to soften itself out of respect for what remained. No more questions, no more declarations. The war of words was over. All that remained now was the quiet aftermath of 2 women sitting in the ruins of things unspoken. No longer shielded by the armor of performance, no longer hidden behind roles or reputations. Just them, and history, and breath. It was Jasmine who moved first, not abruptly, not even deliberately. Her hands simply reached out, slow and open, across the space that just hours ago had been filled with tension, lights, and the burden of 1,000 unspoken expectations. Her fingers curled gently around Ilhan's, not with urgency, not for show, but with the kind of weight that says, "I see you, and I am still here." No words accompanied the gesture, no fanfare, no applause, just the press of skin against skin, a grip forged not in agreement but in endurance. Ilhan didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned into it, just slightly, just enough to close the last inch between solidarity and something far more sacred. Recognition without condition. Her thumb moved ever so slightly along Jasmine's knuckle, a barely there motion, more instinct than choice, but one that said everything words would only dilute. And then, after an hour of composure, control, and measured confession, Ilhan Omar smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't bright, but it was real. The kind of smile that belongs only to people who have survived being misunderstood for so long. They'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be heard. Her shoulders lowered by a centimeter, the invisible armor around her spine loosening for the first time all night. Her gaze lifted, not toward the door, not toward the cameras, but straight into Jasmine's eyes. "You just reminded me," Ilhan whispered, voice hoarse, edged with something between awe and exhaustion, "why I came here in the first place." She didn't mean the studio, and Jasmine knew it. She meant the fight. She meant the purpose. She meant every vote, every headline, every death threat, every sleepless night wondering if the country she served would ever see her as anything more than an idea to be dissected. She meant why she had survived. Jasmine didn't answer with words. She just nodded, one slow, grounded motion that felt like the sealing of something timeless. She squeezed Ilhan's hand a little tighter, then released it with the precision of someone who knew the exact weight of vulnerability and when to let it breathe. The room around them was empty now. The stage hands were gone. The floor manager had slipped away hours ago. The only illumination came from the overhead work lights, cold, white, impersonal. But between the two chairs at the center of the stage, something still glowed. Not light, but a residue, a heat, a kind of post-battle warmth that doesn't show up in pictures or reviews, but lives in the muscle memory of people who have survived something true together. They stood, slowly. Neither of them rushed. The moment didn't demand speed, it demanded gravity. Ilhan rose first, smoothing her jacket out of habit, not presentation. Jasmine followed, straightening her back not because anyone was watching, but because standing tall was all she had ever known. There was no music to walk out to, no press line to greet, just the sound of two sets of heels crossing a stage that no longer belonged to television, but to testimony. They didn't speak as they walked. They didn't need to. They weren't walking as politicians now. They weren't walking as guests. They weren't walking as rivals, or allies, or icons. They were walking as co-survivors of a system designed to chew up their silence and spit out their dignity. And for once, they were walking off the battlefield with someone beside them. They reached the studio's rear exit, past the curtain, where the hallway lights hummed with the sterile flicker of after-hours fluorescent. A lone janitor nodded as they passed. Just a small, human nod, but one Jasmine returned with quiet clarity. Ilhan exhaled, the kind of breath that tastes like release, the kind you don't even realize you've been holding until someone else enters the room and gives you permission to let it go. Outside, the city of Washington, D.C. stretched out beneath the night sky like a sleeping titan, its monuments cold with marble memory, its windows glowing with bureaucratic insomnia. A black car waited at the curb, tinted and sleek, its engine murmuring like protocol, but neither woman moved toward it just yet. They stood for another second, two silhouettes cast in amber parking lot light, their shadows long and crossing on the concrete beneath them. And for that one final moment, they weren't public servants. They weren't symbols. They weren't vessels for progress or objects of scorn. They were daughters of fire, molded by injustice, baptized by silence, and remade in each other's reflection. They didn't leave that studio as friends. They left as something rarer, witnesses to each other's fight. Not because they believed the same things, but because they believed in being unafraid together. And as Jasmine stepped toward her car and Ilhan reached for the door handle of hers, they didn't say goodbye. They just looked at each other, nodded once more, and carried the silence with them. Not as burden, but as proof they had finally been seen. And as both women disappeared into the night, each stepping into separate vehicles but carrying the same unshakable silence, the studio lights dimmed for the final time. What they didn't know, what no one knew in that moment, was that the real impact hadn't started yet. The cameras had turned off, yes, but the footage had been captured, archived, filed. And 27 minutes later, the control room intern, eyes still wet from a story he hadn't expected to feel, hit export, then upload. And without a single press release, without a single promotional post from the network's PR team, the revolution began. It started slow. One clip, grainy and raw, posted to a small Twitter account under the caption, "This moment between Jasmine Crockett and Ilhan Omar." It just changed the game. Watch until the end. Then came the cascade. By the 1 hour mark, it had reached 30,000 views. By the second, over 600,000. By dawn, 11.4 million. People weren't just watching. They were pausing, rewinding, screenshotting. The segment where Jasmine described the boy outside the convenience store, her voice steady and low, standing alone with only a live stream as armor, that clip cracked something open. It was shared by activists, teachers, former prosecutors, mothers. Then came the cut to Ilhan, silent, shattered, one tear falling like a blade through generations of silence. That was the moment that broke the dam. A major black media outlet gave the segment a name, Moments That Rewrote Silence. And the phrase took off like fire across dry kindling. By lunchtime, major journalists were dissecting the frame-by-frame shifts in Ilhan's facial expression. Body language experts on TikTok analyzed her pause, the subtle swallow in her throat before she said, "No one has ever said it like that." News anchors stumbled over how to describe it. Not quite a breakdown, not quite a breakthrough. But viewers didn't need the language. They understood what had happened because it had happened to them. What followed wasn't a wave. It was a rupture. Emails began flooding into the network. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Not complaints, not controversy. Letters, handwritten, typed, dictated from hospital beds, prison libraries, late-night break rooms. They came from young women who had never seen themselves protected, only pitied. From middle-aged organizers who had stood on the front lines with no cameras and no coverage. From daughters of immigrants, survivors of silence, women who had spent their lives screaming into rooms that never listened. One message, posted publicly and reshared 4.7 million times, read, "Dear Representative Crockett and Representative Omar, I watched your talk show in the back of a city bus, riding home from my third job. I paused it 5 times because I couldn't stop crying. I've never seen power look like that. I've never seen someone look scared and still stand anyway. That's what you gave me, permission, to shake and still speak." The hashtag #We Shake. We Speak was born within hours. Students started organizing pop-up screenings in college auditoriums, lighting candles afterward in silence. One HBCU professor replaced her entire semester's syllabus with a single instruction. Watch that interview, then write what you've never dared say. A 15-year-old girl from Baltimore posted a video of herself reading Jasmine's mother's quote in front of her school's main hallway. "Speak when your voice shakes. That's when it matters most." The clip was viewed 12 million times in 36 hours. But beyond the numbers, beyond the likes, the shares, the analysis, was something slower, deeper, and more untraceable. Women stopped apologizing. In classrooms, in board meetings, in courtrooms, on stages. Something in the cultural bloodstream had changed. Representation had shifted form. It was no longer a poster. It wasn't just a photo on a voting pamphlet. It was Jasmine standing in heels in the Texas heat. It was Ilhan not flinching when the tears came. It was not performance. It was embodiment. And the word representation started to mean something else. For decades, it had been thrown around like a prize, as if proximity to power was power itself, as if one person in a room was enough to call it inclusive. But now, after that video, after that night, young women began to rewrite the word. Representation wasn't being in the room. It was naming the fire you walk through to get there. It was sitting in the chair and telling the truth even when your voice trembled and your hands wouldn't stop sweating. It was holding your ground in the face of systemic silence and daring to call it by name. An open letter campaign was launched on day 4. Title, You Made Representation an Action. Over 78,000 women signed it in the first 72 hours. Some added stories, others added names. Most just wrote, "Thank you for not flinching when it mattered." Jasmine responded with a single post. "We don't need perfect leaders. We need brave ones. And brave is what happens when you speak, even if the room shakes with you." Ilhan followed with a line that lit the match again. "If I could cry on national TV and still stand, so can you." Prints of that quote began appearing across subway stations in New York, painted onto school walls in Oakland, etched into glass at a domestic violence shelter in Chicago. It wasn't politics anymore. It wasn't trending. It was gospel. Something had been handed down that night, not just from one generation to the next, but from one survivor to another. And in that passing, the silence finally broke. Not with noise, not with slogans, but with truth that refused to ask permission. In one of the most widely shared interviews after the event, a CNN host tried to ask Ilhan, "Were you surprised by the public reaction?" She paused, then gave the smallest of smiles, the kind that doesn't seek validation. "Surprised? Number, I think we always knew the silence was full. We just didn't know the world was finally ready to hear what it had been holding." And somewhere in Dallas, a mother's words, scribbled in ink and carried in a folded note for years, had detonated into something vast and unstoppable. Speak when your voice shakes. That's when it matters most. And now millions of voices were doing just that. And as the noise faded and the headlines began to simmer, the world moved forward, as it always does. Movements evolve, stories shift, and even the most seismic moments are eventually folded into memory. But not for everyone. Not for those who had been cracked open by the broadcast. Not for those who had lived in silence and now recognized their own reflection in the space it left behind. And not for Ilhan Omar. Because for her, it didn't end when the cameras stopped. It didn't end when the hashtags faded or when the press cycle moved on to the next catastrophe. For her, something had been reawakened. Something too deep to name, too personal to share. But it burned inside her all the same. Quiet, relentless, and sacred. So when a small university in the Northeast reached out, asking if she would deliver the keynote speech at their spring commencement, Ilhan didn't hesitate. She didn't send a surrogate. She didn't submit a statement. She wrote the speech herself. The day of the ceremony, the sky was split wide open with light, a canvas of blue so clear it looked unreal. The stage was built in the middle of the quad, a black platform surrounded by folding chairs in tension. Rows of graduates, cloaked in identical robes, shimmered in the sun like waves. But beneath the symmetry were stories. Immigrant daughters, first-generation fighters, women who had clawed their way to the edge of power with bruised hands and sleepless nights. Ilhan saw them, all of them. And as she took the podium, the crowd hushed, not from obligation, but reverence. She stood tall. No notes, no teleprompter. Just a single folded sheet in her pocket, untouched. "When I first stood behind a microphone," she began, "I didn't know if anyone would hear me, or if they'd just wait for me to fail." Her voice was clear, grounded. "And for a long time, I believed I had to sound invincible just to be allowed to speak at all. But I've learned something in these years inside the fire, and I'd like to share it with you now. Not as a politician, not as a guest, but as a woman still learning how to be whole." There was no stirring in the crowd. Even the wind held its breath. "I won't name names," she continued, her eyes scanning the horizon above the students' caps. "But a few months ago, I sat on a stage across from someone who reminded me of something I had forgotten. Something powerful, something terrifying, and something true." She reached into her pocket slowly, carefully, and pulled out the folded paper. A piece so worn its corners were nearly translucent. "She carried this with her for years," Ilhan said, voice thinner now, more fragile. A note from someone she loved, someone she lost. It wasn't meant for me, but it reached me anyway. And now, I want to give it to you. She unfolded the paper and read the words aloud. Her voice didn't tremble. It cracked, but it didn't break. Speak when your voice shakes. That's when it matters most. The words hung in the air like a drumbeat that refused to fade. A few gasps from the crowd, a sob from the back row. But Ilhan didn't look at them. She looked up, straight into the sky. The blue above was endless, stretched like memory, untouched by noise or fear. And for a moment, it looked almost too perfect, like something waiting to be broken. She smiled, the first real smile she had worn since that night, the kind that wasn't for cameras, the kind that came only when truth had finally made its way through the bones. Across the country, in a modest home office lit only by a desk lamp and laptop screen, Jasmine Crockett watched alone. She wasn't scheduled to speak that day. She had turned down 3 interviews, but she had made time for this. Her phone buzzed constantly beside her, texts from colleagues and journalists asking if she was watching. She didn't answer. When Ilhan read the words, her mother's words, something in Jasmine's throat closed. Not just with pride, not just with memory, but with the strange, aching beauty of being known without being named. Ilhan hadn't said her name. She didn't need to, because sometimes the most sacred things are not shouted, but held. And then it happened. Jasmine cried, not like the single tear Ilhan had let fall on national television, but quietly, fully, the kind of cry that comes not from pain, but from release, a kind of holy grief, the recognition that something you carried alone has now become part of the world's language. She pressed her fingers to her lips, as if to keep something sacred inside. Back at the university, Ilhan closed her speech with a whisper, not because her voice had failed, but because she knew they were ready to listen. "So when you leave this place," she said, "I don't want you to be fearless. I want you to tremble and still speak, because your voice, even shaking, can be the thing that keeps someone else from being swallowed by silence." There was no standing ovation, not immediately, because no one wanted to move. No one wanted to interrupt the gravity that had fallen like ash across their robes. But then it started. From the left corner, a slow rise, then another, and another, until every graduate stood, and then the faculty, and then the parents, and then the staff. The quad erupted, not with noise, but with presence. No one shouted. They just stood, like they had just been handed something they never expected to receive. And as Ilhan stepped down from the podium, tucking the note carefully back into her pocket, she knew this wasn't closure. This wasn't the end of anything. It was a return to the reason she came, to the fight she had almost forgotten how to name, to the woman who reminded her that fear is not an enemy, it is a compass, and that shaking doesn't mean you stop. It means you begin. And somewhere in Texas, one woman wept and smiled and whispered the words back into her own hands. That's when it matters most. And as the crowd stood still beneath that open sky, and Jasmine wiped silent tears in a room no one could see, something larger than applause pulsed through the collective heart of every witness. It was not the end of a speech, not the peak of a viral moment. It was the quiet aftershock of truth finally being spoken, not in protest, but in purpose. And as the screen faded to black and names rolled in digital silence, the lesson remained. Not in the headlines, but in the ache it left behind. Because stories like this don't end. They echo. They settle in the blood. They change the way we breathe. What this moment taught, what it seared into the bones of everyone who saw it, is that injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through rules. Sometimes it hides behind silence. Sometimes it looks like a locked door, a raised eyebrow, a mic turned off, a name that no one says out loud. For Ilhan, injustice wasn't always someone shouting her down. It was rooms full of allies going quiet when the fire reached her. For Jasmine, it wasn't the threats that hurt the most. It was the fact that her courage nearly cost her everything. And still, no one came to stand beside her until she screamed alone for 6 hours in the dark. The human lesson is not that courage is loud or clean or triumphant. The lesson is that courage often hurts. It isolates. It humiliates. It strips you bare in public and dares you to keep standing. This story revealed that we have mistaken silence for neutrality and composure for strength. But what Jasmine and Ilhan did, what they showed the world in those stolen, unscripted moments, was that the most powerful act of defiance is simply choosing to remain whole in a world that keeps trying to break you into parts. And there is another lesson, quieter but just as vital. That empathy is not a performance. It's not retweeting a quote or nodding during a panel. It's the risk of recognition. It's looking at someone else's bruises and saying, I have those too, even when the room isn't safe, especially when the room isn't safe. Because when Ilhan turned away and cried, and when Jasmine didn't flinch but simply reached out with her eyes and her silence, what they gave us wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a blueprint for survival, for dignity, for not letting pain calcify into bitterness, but instead letting it become fuel for something real. They taught us that real representation isn't about perfection. It's about proximity. Proximity to pain, proximity to risk. It's not about climbing high enough to avoid the storm. It's about standing in the rain long enough to call it out by name so someone else doesn't drown thinking they're alone. Jasmine didn't become a symbol because she stood at a podium. She became one because she stayed on the sidewalk, in the heat, under the weight of a system designed to outlast her. Ilhan didn't break the silence because she cried. She broke it because she let the world see her cry and still didn't run from the light. The human truth is this: fear is not a flaw. It is a signal that what you're doing matters, that the risk is real, that the cost is not performative. And so when Jasmine said, I was afraid, but if I didn't stand there, who would be next to be swallowed by silence? She wasn't just recounting a night in Dallas. She was naming a question that lives inside every person who's ever wondered if their pain was worth the noise it would make. And Ilhan, when she said, you reminded me why I came here in the first place, she wasn't just thanking Jasmine. She was admitting something raw, that even warriors forget, that even icons falter, that even those who carry the burden of change sometimes forget why they started and need someone else, someone with a voice still trembling, to remind them that purpose is not forged in clarity, but in chaos, that we do not need to be unshakable to speak. We just need to speak even when we shake, especially when we shake. And that is the final, most dangerous truth this story offers. That shaking is not the symptom of weakness, it is the proof of presence. It is the sound of someone daring to stay, even when everything in them wants to run. And when we speak while shaking, when we stand with our knees buckling and our voices cracking, we break something. Not ourselves, the silence, the illusion, the machinery that depends on our stillness to keep turning. So here is the lesson, stitched in blood and truth. You don't need to roar to be powerful. You need to be honest. You don't need to be fearless. You need to be willing. Willing to speak when it costs you. Willing to tremble in public. Willing to be the first voice that dares say, this is not okay. This is not over. This is not the best we can do. The world will not hand you safety, but you can hand someone else their courage. And that, more than any policy, more than any title, more than any victory lap, is how change begins. Not with perfection, but with one voice, shaking, still speaking, and someone else finally listening. And if that was the lesson, if the silence was shattered, the tear was seen, the truth was finally spoken, then here comes the question that can no longer be avoided. What will you do with what you've just witnessed? Because moments like this do not come wrapped in applause. They do not leave behind trophies or tidy headlines. They leave behind responsibility. They leave behind weight. And if you felt that weight pressed down on your chest as Jasmine stood alone in the Texas heat, if you felt your throat close as Ilhan's voice cracked and she spoke anyway, then understand this. You are no longer a spectator. You are implicated. You are chosen. You are called. Because silence is not neutral. Silence is not safety. Silence is complicity stitched in professional tone and polite avoidance. The world is burning behind closed doors, and far too many have mistaken inaction for wisdom. But not you. Not anymore. Because now you know that a single act of courage can rewrite the rules of what we accept and what we refuse to let happen again. So don't you dare return to your timeline and scroll past this moment like it was content. This was not content. This was a rupture in the machine, a crack in the illusion that power only belongs to those with platforms, cameras, and titles. Jasmine wasn't famous when she stood for 6 hours. Ilhan wasn't protected when she cried on live television. They didn't move the world because they were untouchable. They moved it because they let themselves be touched by the fire and chose not to flinch. The question is, will you? Will you raise your hand in that meeting and say what no one else will? Will you write the post that may cost you likes but save someone's dignity? Will you pull someone aside when others look away? Will you refuse the promotion that asks for your silence as payment? Will you protect the next Jasmine before she's left alone on the curb? Will you catch the next Ilhan before the silence swallows her whole? Because if not you, then who? Do not let the elegance of these women fool you into thinking their path was paved in support. Their path was littered with landmines, legal threats, racist headlines, anonymous voicemails, and the silent betrayal of people who knew better but chose quiet. Every time Jasmine live-streamed, she didn't know if she'd make it home. Every time Ilhan raised her voice in Congress, she risked being stripped not just of her seat, but of her humanity. They did not act because it was safe. They acted because they could not live with themselves if they didn't. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, not the shine of confidence, but the refusal to let fear dictate your voice. The stubborn decision to show up shaking and still speak. And now that decision is yours. This is not just about protest. This is about presence. This is not just about resistance. This is about refusal to disappear. This is not just about admiring bravery. This is about becoming the next link in the chain. The system only survives when people keep saying, "It's not my place." It crumbles when people like you decide, "This is exactly where I belong." So make no mistake, the revolution won't come from the top down. It will come from the bottom up, from the break rooms, from the classrooms, from the family dinners where silence used to win, from the student council meetings, from the people who stop asking, when will they change things, and when start saying, we are they. You don't need permission. You don't need to be polished. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to be present, fully, unapologetically. And if your voice shakes, good, let it. Because that is when the world listens. That is when people feel less alone. That is when lies lose their footing. That is when power feels threatened. That is when truth takes root. So here's what you do. You write the story that hasn't been told. You speak the line that has lived too long in your throat. You sit beside someone the world wants to erase. And you do not leave when it gets uncomfortable. You interrupt. You intervene. You insist. You don't let a coworker get mocked because of their accent. You don't let a woman be silenced in a meeting because her tone makes people uneasy. You don't let another human being bleed out in the middle of a system that demands their silence as payment for survival. You fight, not because you are without fear. You fight because fear has no claim over your conscience anymore. And if you don't know where to start here. Call someone out with compassion. Step in, even when the issue isn't yours. Ask better questions. Protect the space for truth, even if it costs you approval. Send the message. File the complaint. Raise your voice, even if it breaks. And when someone turns to you and says, "Aren't you afraid?" Say what Jasmine said. Say it with your whole shaking chest. Of course I'm afraid. But if I don't stand here, who will be next to be swallowed by silence? Because now you know what that silence costs. You saw it in Ilhan's tear. You heard it in Jasmine's voice. You felt it in your chest. So don't deny it. Don't waste it. Don't wait. You've seen what happens when one woman dares to speak in the heat. You've seen what happens when another dares to weep under lights. Now show us what happens when you answer the call. Not later. Not when you're ready. Not when the stakes are lower. Now because someone is watching. Someone whose life may change not because of a law, but because of a look, a line, a choice you make today. So make it count. Be the interruption. Be the disruption. Be the one who speaks when their voice shakes. That's when it matters most. That's when it begins. That's when you become impossible to ignore. And if your heart is still beating a little faster, good. Hold on to that. That pulse, that pressure in your chest, that's not adrenaline. That's awareness. It's the body remembering what it means to be awake, not just politically, not just socially, but morally. It's the sound of your conscience standing up inside you. Don't quiet it. Don't smother it beneath the comfort of distraction or the numbness of normalcy. Because the world is counting on your apathy. The system is betting that this fire inside you will cool by morning. Don't let it. Let this be the moment you stop waiting for someone else to be first. Let this be the day you stop editing your truth to make others comfortable. The truth is already sharp. It doesn't need your hesitation. It needs your voice. Loud, cracked, trembling, defiant. If you're not shaking, you're not close enough to what matters. So lean in. Say the hard thing. Hold the line when the room turns quiet. Don't let people joke away what breaks your heart. Don't let them twist courage into conflict or honesty into disruption. Disrupt anyway, because silence doesn't protect you. It erases you. And when they call you difficult, call yourself necessary. When they call you angry, say thank you. When they say your standards are too high, tell them the floor is what's killing people. You are not too much. You are not too loud. You are right on time. And the world needs your imperfection more than it needs your performance. Because what Jasmine did, what Ilhan carried, what every woman who has ever dared to speak truth to power has taught us, is that change does not come gently. It breaks. It cracks. It shatters glass so someone else can see through it. So be the one who speaks. Be the one who stays. Be the one who doesn't leave the table just because the conversation turns sharp. Let your voice be the one someone else remembers when they're standing on their own street, under their own streetlight, with no one watching but the world that pretends not to see. And when that moment comes, and it will come, remember this. You don't need to be fearless. You need to be faithful to truth, to justice, to the trembling inside you. Because that tremble, that's the sound of history making room, and it's calling your name. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside a tense Supreme Court hearing, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts Chief Justices John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett over one of the most explosive allegations in judicial history: secret deals, hidden finances, and ethics violations at the highest level. Roberts and Barrett push back, calling her claims outrageous. But minutes later, Jasmine reveals recordings and financial transfers that no one in the room can deny. Just as the chamber erupts, FBI agents storm in with warrants in hand, leaving both justices stunned and speechless. If the guardians of justice are the ones rigging the system, is America already too late to save itself? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Supreme Court chamber had never felt more suffocating. Ornate ceilings loomed overhead like silent judges of their own, and the room, normally dominated by whispers of reverence, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Every seat was filled. Federal agents in dark suits stood along the back walls, arms crossed. Legal scholars from Yale and Georgetown whispered behind notepads, and from the press row, lenses pointed forward like loaded weapons. This wasn't a routine hearing. It was a constitutional rupture. A special session convened for a case so rare it bordered on the unthinkable. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing the United States House of Representatives, had come to formally accuse sitting members of the Supreme Court of grave ethical misconduct. The judiciary itself was on trial. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, a single figure wrapped in tension, dwarfed by the architecture, but radiating something sharper than fear: purpose. Above her, Chief Justice John Roberts sat perched like a monument, his expression unreadable beneath decades of polished restraint. Next to him, Justice Amy Coney Barrett leaned back in her chair, her eyes cool, her posture confident, arms folded in a silent dare. The weight of the room pressed inward, but Jasmine didn't bend. She stepped forward, her heels clicking once, twice, on the polished marble floor, then stopped. Her hands were empty, but her presence was armed. "If no one else has the courage to speak truth to power," she said, her voice unwavering, "then I will do it. Today, in this chamber, in front of every camera and every witness in this republic." A shift moved through the crowd. Barely a sound, just breath held and glances exchanged. Roberts's brow twitched, a flicker of disdain. Barrett smirked faintly as if watching a child try to lecture a parent. Jasmine knew that look. She'd seen it 1,000 times. Men and women in polished robes who mistook confidence for arrogance, defiance for recklessness. But what they didn't see was what the room now felt. She wasn't here to plead, she was here to confront. "I was not invited here to make polite conversation," she continued, her words slicing clean and sharp. "I was summoned by my oath to protect the Constitution from all threats, foreign and domestic, even those cloaked in authority." At the defense bench, a senior court clerk shifted uncomfortably. One of the journalists muttered, "She's not backing down." And she wasn't, because this wasn't just another hearing. It was a war of narratives. And Jasmine Crockett had just fired the first shot, with no intention of missing. And yet, just as Jasmine's voice had begun to echo in the bones of the room, the old guard moved to reclaim their ground. Not with evidence, but with derision. Chief Justice John Roberts leaned forward slowly, as if preparing to deliver a verdict already written in his mind. His voice emerged cool and practiced, the voice of a man who had never been publicly questioned without consequence. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, tone deliberately measured, "this proceeding, let us be clear, is not about judicial ethics. It is about political theater." The words struck not like an argument, but like a verdict. "You're staging a spectacle," he continued, "under the pretense of constitutional duty. But the court is not your campaign stage, nor your personal battlefield." The impact was immediate. A few muffled snorts of amusement came from the back rows. Someone, likely a federal clerk, chuckled audibly before catching himself. Jasmine didn't blink. She had expected resistance. But the next voice came quicker and sharper. "Let's dispense with the performance," said Justice Amy Coney Barrett, cutting Jasmine off mid-sentence. "You have brought forward allegations that are at best speculative and at worst slanderous." She leaned back in her chair with deliberate confidence, crossing her arms. "What you're doing here," she said, "is not bravery. It's opportunism draped in indignation." Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but Barrett raised a single finger, silencing her without saying a word. "We've reviewed your submitted materials," Barrett went on, her voice taking on the cadence of a lecture. "They are riddled with conspiracy theories, half-formed narratives, and an astounding disregard for precedent. I'm not sure whether to treat them as a legal brief or fan fiction." The court chamber erupted in stifled laughter. A senior attorney from a prominent D.C. firm shook his head and scribbled something sarcastic into his legal pad. Across the aisle, a younger law clerk whispered to her neighbor, "She walked into a buzzsaw." Jasmine stood alone, stone still at the podium, but the silence around her wasn't respectful. It was calculated. Barrett glanced to Roberts with the satisfied smirk of a performer who knew the crowd was with her. "Frankly," she said, "this hearing demeans the very institution it claims to defend." And then with one last surgical line, "You're mistaking noise for evidence and outrage for law." It was the kind of dismissal that didn't just refute an argument, it erased it. Around the courtroom, tension thickened into suffocation. Jasmine was not just being opposed, she was being outnumbered, outtalked, and undermined by smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Every time she began a sentence, Barrett spoke louder. Every time she appealed to decorum, Roberts answered with condescension. This wasn't debate, it was ritual humiliation, wrapped in the robes of procedure. The gallery absorbed it all, some with discomfort, others with smug approval. And still Jasmine remained upright, though the weight pressing down on her was no longer just institutional, It was personal. A single question hung over the chamber like smoke clinging to old wood. How long could she stand, alone, before they silenced her completely? But humiliation only works if the subject believes it, and Jasmine Crockett did not. For 40 relentless minutes, she had been carved open, word by word, glance by glance, by the very institution sworn to serve justice. Interrupted, belittled, stripped of credibility in real time by robed titans cloaked in centuries of unchecked reverence. They had reduced her voice to background noise, her presence to political nuisance. And the courtroom, that sacred cathedral of law, had become a stage for coordinated erosion. Barrett's interruptions were no longer challenges. They were weapons. Roberts's cold authority was no longer neutral. It was strategic silence. Every paper shuffled by a clerk, every stifled chuckle from the rear bench, tightened the vice around Jasmine's presence. And so, after the 41st interruption, she did what no one expected. She said nothing. She simply stopped. Lowering her gaze, she gathered her documents slowly, methodically, like a soldier policing the field after a battle lost. Not a single paper was crumpled, not a single word revised. She wasn't retreating. She was remembering every time she'd been told to wait her turn, to speak less boldly, to survive systems not built for voices like hers. The courtroom watched with the smug anticipation of victory, assuming they had weathered her challenge. Roberts leaned back. Barrett exhaled through her nose, visibly pleased. Somewhere in the press box, a reporter began typing the opening line of an obituary. Crockett folds under fire. But then Jasmine did something that rewrote the oxygen in the room. Her fingers paused. Her head lifted. Not fast, not theatrical, but with a certainty that rewound the very arc of the morning. Her eyes, once burning with restrained defiance, now held something calmer and infinitely more dangerous. Resolve without mercy. From the inside lining of her blazer, she produced a small rectangular object. It gleamed under the chandelier's light. A silver USB drive, unmarked except for the weight it carried. She held it between two fingers, arm extended, the way one might offer a blade back to its owner. "If you won't believe me," she said, her voice low, steady, and so controlled it rang louder than any gavel, "then perhaps you'll believe yourselves." No reaction came, only silence. A different kind now, no longer dismissive, but bracing. Jasmine stepped away from the podium and approached the court's evidence terminal. Her movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as if invoking a final clause in a contract the court didn't know it had signed. A clerk instinctively stood, but Roberts gave no command. Barrett's eyes narrowed, but her mouth didn't move. Crockett inserted the drive. For a moment, the screen remained dark, ominously blank. Then it flickered. The seal of the United States appeared in stark grayscale on the massive monitor above the bench. The light from the screen cast a pale wash across the mahogany desks, the marble columns, and the stone-set faces of every justice present. It was no longer the courtroom that felt powerful. It was the screen, the drive, the truth waiting to be heard. Jasmine stepped back, her hands at her sides. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The chamber, once humming with contempt, now stood at the edge of something irreversible. The silence following the screen's activation was longer than expected. Long enough for a few in the gallery to wonder if the file had failed to load. Then it began. The voice emerged, crisp and indisputable, from the embedded speakers that flanked the chamber like invisible sentinels. "Once that case clears the lower court," the voice said, clear, unhurried, chilling in its confidence, "we vote 6-3. Gorsuch won't resist it. Roberts wants it handled quietly. The rest will follow our lead." The speaker didn't identify herself. She didn't need to. The tone, the cadence, the rhythm between sentences. Everyone in that room knew that voice. It was Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The screen displayed an audio waveform alongside a timestamp. April 2nd, 9:27 a.m. The subject matter, the EPA's pending regulatory case, hadn't even been heard in oral arguments until the following month. And yet here she was, calmly and clinically discussing the outcome, the vote count, the internal pressure points. She even gave a small laugh when someone off mic asked about donor reactions. A beat passed, then another line played. This case isn't about law. It's about how the decision is going to land politically. We can't afford a messy dissent. Keep the language clean. This one needs to send the right message to the right people. You could hear someone inhale sharply from the left wing of the gallery. One court officer stepped forward, then froze mid-step. Journalists stared at each other, eyes wide, pens motionless. Even the stenographer, trained to keep recording no matter what, hesitated long enough to miss a word. On the bench, Barrett had gone still, completely still, not blinking, not breathing, not moving. It was the kind of stillness that only happens when a mind races faster than a body can contain. Jasmine Crockett didn't move either. She stood beneath the screen, hands loosely clasped in front of her, expression unreadable. The overhead lights had dimmed automatically to give focus to the monitor, casting the courtroom into a half shadow that made it feel suddenly more like a tribunal than a court of law. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She let Barrett's voice do all the speaking, and the voice kept going. We know how this one's going to play out. The filings don't matter, they're just for show. What really matters is consistency. If we hand the right side a clean win, they'll stick with us next cycle. Don't give the other side anything they can turn into a headline. It was that sentence, the last one, that broke the air. From the media pit, camera shutters fired like artillery. Someone in the second row whispered, Jesus Christ. A reporter from The Atlantic scribbled a single word in their notebook, predetermined. At the far end of the courtroom, an older law professor from New York University turned to a colleague and muttered, She just confessed to outcome engineering. Before anyone could process the full gravity of what they were hearing, the screen shifted. The left half remained occupied by the still rolling audio, but the right half now populated with a PDF, an official document stamped with the insignia of the Department of the Treasury and the DOJ. Jasmine moved for the first time, reaching toward the console and enlarging the page with two precise taps. There it was. The document detailed a financial transaction of $215,000, transferred from the Westland Foundation to a private investment trust under the control of Chief Justice John Roberts. The payment had been made on March 14th, just 3 days before Roberts issued a majority opinion that favored a pharmaceutical corporation in a high-stakes liability case. The memo attached to the transfer described it vaguely as an advisory consultation, with a note indicating the arrangement was non-public. No red flags had been raised at the time, but now in context it felt radioactive. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't have to. The screen provided the rest. Below the memo line were transaction notes cross-referenced with a Treasury audit trail. The system had flagged the payment for unusual timing due to its proximity to the ruling, but no action had been taken until now. This wasn't an accusation. This was a documented event. Cold, verified, damning. The entire courtroom changed temperature. Justice Roberts' jaw tightened. He tried to look away from the screen but couldn't. Not because he was transfixed, but because to look away would be to admit guilt. Barrett still hadn't moved. She was no longer a figure of icy confidence. She looked like stone cracked by frost. One of the assistant clerks, maybe 25 years old, sat motionless with his hand frozen on the corner of his notepad. And then the murmurs began. Not loud at first, but desperate, barely contained whispers between legal scholars and agency officials. An NPR journalist mouthed the words money trail to her colleague. A former federal judge in the gallery leaned forward, visibly shaken. Even the justices seated at the far end of the bench, those not yet implicated, shifted in their seats, suddenly very aware of the weight of their silence. Cameras pivoted, lights flicked on. The media knew what this was now. This was history. This was scandal not wrapped in theory, but sewn into facts. Still standing beneath the screen, still surrounded by silence thick as courtroom oak, Jasmine Crockett finally turned to face the justices again. Her voice was low, not a shout, not a performance, but a blade that slid straight into the silence and split it clean. Justice, she said, cannot wear a robe just to sell the outcome. She stepped forward, one step, no more. It cannot drape itself in reverence while cashing checks behind closed doors. No one moved, because now no one dared pretend they hadn't heard. The air was no longer still. It was stretched so tight that the walls themselves seemed to listen. And then, like a thread finally snapping beneath tension, a new voice cut through the courtroom. From the third row, a woman stood. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't wait to be called. She simply rose slowly, deliberately, as if this exact moment had been rehearsed alone in 1,000 mirrors. She couldn't have been older than 30. Her features were sharp, almost severe, framed by the kind of stillness that suggested the storm had already passed inside her. A courtroom security officer moved instinctively, but Jasmine Crockett turned and raised a single hand, not to stop the woman, but to clear the path. The chamber, filled with murmurs only moments earlier, dropped into such silence it was possible to hear the echo of her heel as she stepped into the aisle. "My name," she said, her voice carrying not by volume but by clarity, "is Clara Miles." She paused not to gather strength, but to let the name settle, to make sure everyone, especially the ones on the bench, understood that this wasn't a stranger speaking. "I served as a personal aide and internal systems coordinator for Justice Amy Coney Barrett for nearly 4 years." She said it without shame, but each word landed like a tremor beneath Barrett's chair. Roberts turned slightly, eyes narrowing. Barrett remained still, but the shift in her posture was unmistakable. Her shoulders drew tighter. Her hand, resting on the polished desk in front of her, curled faintly. "I wasn't a policymaker," Clara continued. "I didn't write opinions. I didn't wear robes. I just kept things moving, calendar updates, encrypted briefings, secure call records. Nothing glamorous, nothing headline-worthy. Until one morning in February, 2 months before the Frederick ruling, Justice Barrett asked me to access the internal server and delete the communication logs from the last 4 multi-chamber teleconferences." She stopped again, not to breathe, but to check the justices. Barrett hadn't flinched. Not yet. "I asked her if we were archiving the recordings first," Clara said, the words now measured like steps in a minefield. "She said no, that these weren't necessary to retain, that they were informal strategic discussions and should remain internal to prevent misinterpretation." Her voice didn't rise, but it grew heavier, like each sentence carried the weight of betrayal. "I'd never been told to delete raw judicial coordination data before. Not once. And I've never been asked since, by anyone else." In the back row, a legal historian began writing furiously. On the right flank, an official from the Judicial Ethics Office adjusted her glasses twice without looking down. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. The moment belonged to Clara and to the decision she had made when no one was looking. "I was supposed to wipe the backups, delete the trace files, ensure the drive clusters were unrecoverable. A full zero right." Her voice finally cracked, just slightly at the edge. "But I didn't." A gasp, small, involuntary, escaped from the gallery. "I kept one," she said softly, "not to hurt her, not to help anyone else, but because I knew, when I heard the way they spoke, that this wasn't about interpretation. It was about control." Her eyes drifted up to the bench now, no longer in fear, but in confrontation. It was about pre-deciding outcomes, about coordinating votes, about how to phrase concurrences so the media wouldn't notice the manipulation. And I couldn't erase that, because if I did, I wouldn't be an aide anymore. I'd be an accomplice. Barrett didn't move, but her stillness had changed. It was no longer regal, it was rigid. Clara took one final step into the open aisle, completely exposed. "This isn't about party," she said. "It's not about politics or even personal failings. It's about what happens when truth is sacrificed for convenience, and when silence becomes the only thing that keeps injustice alive." She turned slightly to face the audience. Not just the justices, the people. "And I won't be silent anymore." No gavel fell, no objection was raised, no justice dared to speak. Because in that moment, Clara Miles wasn't just a witness. She was the reason the courtroom would never again be the same. The air hadn't moved in over a minute, but it felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Clara Miles' final words still lingered in the chamber, like smoke that refused to clear. No rebuttal came. No justice spoke. The room, once dripping with disdain, now sat hollowed and raw. And then, without fanfare, the reckoning stepped through the door. The rear entrance of the Supreme Court opened with the precision of an incision. No guards announced it. No bailiff banged a gavel. But the energy in the chamber shifted instantly, like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm hits. A tall man crossed the threshold, moving like a blade drawn from its sheath. His face was unreadable. His suit was immaculate. And on his belt, the golden badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation glinted like a sealed verdict. He did not hesitate. He did not scan the room. His eyes went straight to the bench, straight to Roberts, straight to Barrett. And the courtroom, already rattled, held its breath again. He stopped at the base of the dais, unhurried, commanding, utterly still. When he spoke, his voice did not rise, but every person heard it like the crack of a bolt locking into place. My name is Special Agent Harlan Voss. I am here on behalf of the Department of Justice in the FBI Public Integrity Division. He paused only to draw a sealed plastic sleeve from a slim case at his side, its edges marked with federal insignia, its contents thick and unmistakably final. Under Judicial Order 24-3821, I am serving federal search and seizure warrants for the immediate confiscation of all personal and professional communication devices, including but not limited to mobile phones, laptops, tablets, and secure storage media, used or maintained by Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The sound that followed wasn't a gasp. It was silence, weaponized, a vacuum of disbelief. Justice Elena Kagan turned toward Roberts in open confusion. The lead clerk dropped his pen. It rolled unnoticed beneath the gallery railing. A cameraman in the press section lowered his lens, as if not believing what he was about to film. Roberts said nothing. Barrett didn't blink, but their stillness was no longer composed. It was defensive, shattered. The warrants, Agent Voss continued with lethal calm, are the result of a 14-month covert investigation authorized under joint oversight from the DOJ's Internal Corruption Division and a special federal judiciary review board. Authorization for electronic surveillance was obtained through FISA channels after repeated patterns of suspicious digital activity and confirmed whistleblower statements. He turned his body slightly, not away from the bench, but toward the record, toward the nation watching. The operation remained classified until corroboration crossed the statutory threshold under Title 18, Sections 201 and 371, regarding bribery of public officials and conspiracy to defraud the United States. Every phrase was a hammer driving deeper into the bedrock of the court. Justice Roberts' hand moved, just barely, just enough to shift one paper an inch forward on the bench. A meaningless motion. A man accustomed to control, now grasping for structure in a room that no longer belonged to him. Barrett's lips pressed tighter. Her fingers, once calm on the wood, now curled into her palm. But Agent Voss was not finished. He gestured without a word. 2 additional agents entered, one from each aisle, each carrying identical matte black evidence bags. Their faces were expressionless. Their movements were surgical. They advanced to opposite ends of the justices' table and laid the bags gently on the oak like surgeons preparing for extraction. No one resisted. No one dared. Because what they were watching was not politics. It was procedure. It was accountability, dressed not in rhetoric, but in chain of custody. And Jasmine Crockett, still standing in the soft glow beneath the evidence screen, watched with the calm of someone who had weathered fire to deliver this moment. Because now, for the first time in that chamber, it was power, not principle, that sat on trial. Even with federal agents now collecting personal devices and formal authority echoing through the chamber, the walls of the Supreme Court hadn't finished bleeding. Justice wasn't done speaking, not through witness or law, but through something colder and harder to deny, digital truth. The screen above the justices shifted again, this time without prompt. The seal of the DOJ vanished, replaced by a grainy digital interface that looked more like a cyber forensics dashboard than anything ever seen inside this chamber. Rows of text scrolled across the left side of the screen, indecipherable at first glance. Clusters of characters, fragmented sentence patterns, odd date stamps. Some in the gallery squinted, unsure what they were looking at. But then in the bottom corner, the screen flashed one word in stark crimson: decrypted. A soft voice came through the speaker system, not Jasmine's, not the FBI's, but the neutral tone of a Justice Department analyst. These records, the voice said, originated from a secure, non-governmental messaging channel linked to Chief Justice John Roberts' personal device. They were recovered following a 14-month surveillance operation authorized by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, targeting covert communication patterns connected to non-declared lobbying entities operating under pharmaceutical fronts. The entire room had turned to ice. The voice continued. The messaging platform was routed through 3 proxy servers, one of which was traced to the Mid-River Policy Forum, an organization registered as a nonprofit think tank, but financially backed by offshore contributions from multiple pharmaceutical conglomerates, including Westland Holdings, Helix Global, and Mirothera. Every name landed like a gavel against stone. Then the first decrypted message appeared in full across the screen. A plain white text bubble, black font, no timestamp, just content. We're holding 5 votes. Thomas is soft, but Barrett's locked. If you want liability coverage, push the brief edits by Friday. Tell Westland it's as close as I can get without raising red flags. The air left the room. This wasn't a policy conversation. This was a Supreme Court justice referencing case manipulation in direct coordination with an undisclosed private entity, before the case had even been decided. Barrett's name was used casually, as if part of a larger strategy. Thomas floated like a chess piece, and Westland, the same foundation that had been linked in financial disclosures earlier, mentioned not as an observer, but as a participant. The second message followed seconds later. The ruling will lean on interstate clause precedent. Kagan won't flip, but it's irrelevant. Draft opinion is with my assistant. Distribution will go through internal channel. No digital trail. That line landed like a blade. Draft opinion, no digital trail. Even the justices who had stayed quiet until now began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Justice Brown Jackson leaned slightly forward, eyes locked on the screen, expression unreadable, but frozen in alarm. A veteran journalist from the New York Times whispered a single word to the reporter beside her. Pre-ruling coordination. It was no longer an allegation. It was methodical. Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her expression remained unchanged, a portrait of devastating control. She had walked into this chamber as an outsider, branded political by those who had treated the court like their inheritance. Now the evidence was doing what her voice had been denied the space to do. Speak with indisputable authority. This wasn't about conflict of interest anymore. This was about collusion, and the bench knew it. The chamber had turned into a crucible. The screen above them still glowed with the residual burn of exposed messages, and yet it was not enough for the court to yield. The system, like a wounded titan, reared up in resistance. Chief Justice John Roberts rose, the weight of his office pressing against his posture like armor, forged over decades. His voice was calm, but unnaturally so, like a rope pulled too tight. "This is a courtroom, not a circus," he said, staring down at Jasmine from the raised bench, eyes narrowed. "You do not speak for justice. You speak for vengeance, for spectacle. What you have done today is tear at the foundation of an institution you swore to uphold." He paused just long enough for the room to inhale. "You are not saving it, Congresswoman Crockett. You are destroying it." Jasmine did not blink. She stepped forward slowly, letting the silence stretch like a bowstring. Her reply did not rise, but it cut. "You mistake exposure for destruction, Chief Justice," she said. "You mistake honesty for heresy because you've spent too long in a place where no one speaks truth unless it flatters power." Her voice grew firmer, each word weighted like a gavel. "I didn't come here to tear down this court. I came to confront what's already rotting inside it. And that rot wears robes." The tension in the room turned physical. No one moved, no one breathed. Robert's lips tightened, but Jasmine had already turned back to the evidence console. Her hand hovered over the final command, her eyes fixed on the bench, not with anger but with sorrow. "You want to speak of foundations," she said, softer now. "Then let's speak of what's been built beneath them." With one tap, the final file loaded. The screen went black for a beat, then it flared to life. grainy but unmistakable. A private Zoom call, three faces, Roberts, Barrett, and a third man whose name tag read only M. Alders, firm 42. There was no courtroom background, no neutral lighting, just private studies, blurred bookshelves, and the sterile blue glow of secrecy. The audio began. Roberts's voice, clear, calm, disturbingly casual. We have an opportunity here to recalibrate constitutional interpretation for at least a generation, but it has to be gradual. We shift the center without announcing it. Then Barrett, her tone sharper, more direct. The language needs to mask the movement. Traditionalist outcomes framed in procedural neutrality. That's how we stabilize long-term decisions, under the radar. And then Alders, the outsider, the financier, the one who didn't wear a robe but controlled those who did. The donors backing this strategy expect continuity, predictable outcomes in line with originalist frameworks. If that's upheld, support will remain discreet and uninterrupted. The courtroom did not erupt. It collapsed inward. No outburst, no gavel, no denial. Just the heavy collective realization of betrayal spoken aloud in the justices' own voices. A justice system not only manipulated, but premeditated, curated, sold. Jasmine stood motionless beneath the screen, not vindicated, not victorious, but furious, in the quiet, sacred way only truth can summon. You said I was tearing down the court, she said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with restrained fury. But I'm not the one making deals in the dark. I'm not the one trading constitutional balance for ideological conquest. She stepped away from the podium and looked straight at Roberts. Justice isn't yours to weaponize, she said, low and unwavering. It belongs to the people who trusted you to wield it without bias. And today, they've heard what you've done with that trust. No one in the room spoke after that, because the court had not been challenged, it had been caught. The image on the screen still lingered, frozen in damning clarity. Three faces, once symbols of impartiality, now rendered as architects of betrayal. The room, packed with the nation's most powerful legal minds, sat suspended in a silence so heavy it no longer felt like silence. It felt like judgment waiting to fall. Then came the shift. From the back of the room, a man in a dark, sharply tailored suit stepped forward. His pace was deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. His presence alone pulled every gaze. He carried no weapon, no badge visible on his chest. But in his hand, held tightly in a sealed folder embossed with the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice, was something far heavier: finality. He stopped just below the bench and unfolded the warrant with the slow precision of a surgeon. The leather strap snapped back, the seal cracked, and then his voice cut through the marble stillness with the force of a thunderclap. On behalf of the United States Department of Justice, and under the authority granted by a federal grand jury indictment reviewed and authorized by the Chief Inspector General for Judicial Conduct, he announced, I am executing arrest warrants for Chief Justice John Glover Roberts and Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The words didn't echo. They detonated. Every living thing in the chamber froze. A court officer dropped his pen. A reporter whispered an expletive before catching his breath. A clerk instinctively stood as if to protest, then slowly sat back down. No one moved beyond that, not from disbelief, but because movement felt suddenly forbidden, as though the entire nation's gaze had turned inward, and no one wanted to be the first to blink. The agent stepped forward next. Two shadows split from the light, dressed not for spectacle, but for certainty. Their suits were unmarked, their faces unreadable. One walked left toward Roberts, the other veered right toward Barrett. Their footfalls were soft, but in the silence they sounded like thunder. Roberts did not stand. His eyes narrowed slightly as if measuring the exact weight of the moment against his long career. The lectures given, the ceremonies attended, the rulings authored with surgical language and unquestioned authority. He looked not at the agent, but at the public gallery, as though searching for a familiar face who might call it all a misunderstanding. None came. The agent reached the steps to the bench and paused. Chief Justice Roberts, he said clearly, You are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, unlawful coordination with private interest groups, and violation of federal ethics statutes under Title 18. No resistance, no denial. Just a faint exhale from Roberts's nostrils as the agent gently but firmly placed a hand on his shoulder. Not aggressively, not theatrically, but as a symbol that even the highest seat in the judicial branch was no longer untouchable. Barrett remained seated too, her expression unreadable. Her hands, folded on the bench just minutes earlier, were now pressed flat against the table as if bracing for impact. Her lips moved slightly, forming a whisper no microphone caught. But her eyes never left Jasmine Crockett. There was no fear in them. Not yet, just disbelief. Like a chess player who'd stared too long at the middle of the board and never noticed the endgame collapsing at the edges. The second agent spoke. Justice Barrett, under the authority of a sealed federal indictment and pursuant to recommendations from the Office of the Inspector General, you are hereby placed under arrest. Charges include premeditated breach of judicial neutrality, conspiracy to tamper with procedural integrity, and abuse of position for ideological gain. He placed a hand on her shoulder with the same precision, the same quiet finality. Still, no one spoke. Not the other justices, not the legal analysts, not the press. Because at that moment, this wasn't a political development. This was a rupture in the myth of invincibility. The press gallery, armed with cameras, microphones, and keyboards, did not erupt into chaos. They documented, but silently. Some recorded, some scribbled. But most simply watched, stunned by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. These weren't rumors anymore. These weren't whispers in closed-door meetings or op-eds wrapped in ambiguity. This was history, turning in real time. For the first time in modern American memory, the highest judges in the land were no longer symbols. They were suspects. Behind the two justices, the great seal of the Supreme Court loomed on the wall, its embossed eagle still proud, its scroll still clutching the words, "Equal justice under law." But beneath it now stood two robed figures under federal arrest, and the contradiction screamed without sound. Even the architecture seemed to recoil, and through it all, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood alone. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile. Her posture remained still, measured, resolute. She had not come to celebrate. She had come to reveal. The years she had spent being interrupted, discredited, called performative by those who wore their bias beneath velvet robes. This was not revenge. It was accountability, dressed in consequence. And yet even that triumph was not pure, because she had not just exposed corruption, she had exposed the fragility of an entire system that had for generations insisted on its moral superiority, insisted that it could police itself, correct itself, protect itself. But today the lie had collapsed, and no one, no conservative, no liberal, no clerk, no justice, could unsee what had just unfolded. The courtroom no longer belonged to Roberts, nor to Barrett, nor even to the institution they represented. It belonged for that moment to the truth. Not the sanitized version written into law school textbooks, but the kind that comes dripping in sacrifice, screaming in silence, and stepping into the light wearing a badge, holding a warrant, and calling time on the era of unchecked power. As the agents began guiding the justices from the bench, without cuffs but unmistakably under arrest, the entire room remained frozen, not because they didn't know what to do next, but because no one, in that storied chamber of marble and myth, had ever expected this day to come. And yet here it was, not a spectacle, not a partisan twist, but the moment the Republic turned the mirror on itself and didn't look away. The doors had not yet closed behind the agents when the silence in the chamber reshaped itself, not as absence of noise, but as the presence of reckoning. The spectacle had ended, but the meaning had just begun to settle. Some in the gallery still sat frozen, others held phones in trembling hands, broadcasting history in real time to a country that would awaken to a reality no longer theoretical. And in the center of it all, still beneath the Great Seal, still bathed in the stark white of the gallery lights, stood Jasmine Crockett. Not as a politician, not as an accuser, but as a woman who had just done what no one else had dared in 2 centuries of judicial tradition, held the robe to account. She didn't turn immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the bench where, just minutes earlier, the two most powerful judicial figures in the United States had sat like monarchs above reproach. Now their chairs stood empty, not by force, but by truth. And truth, for once, had not whispered. It had thundered. Jasmine slowly gathered the last of her documents from the podium, papers now unnecessary, their value eclipsed by what had already been revealed. She placed them carefully into a leather-bound folder, but there was no hurry in her movement. The storm had passed, the wreckage was visible, and all that remained was to name it. Then, with quiet certainty, she stepped away from the podium, heels echoing on the marble like punctuation marks. She stopped at the center of the chamber, no longer speaking from behind a microphone, but as one voice standing at the heart of a reawakened institution. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence around her carried her words like sacred air. "Today," she said, her voice resolute, "we did not lose the Supreme Court." A pause followed, long enough for the weight to land, for every ear in the room to lean forward. "We reclaimed it, from those who turned it into their private instrument, from those who cloaked corruption in tradition and called it continuity, from those who forgot that justice is not loyalty to an ideology, but to the people." She let the words linger. There were no cameras clicking now, no papers rustling, only breath, and what truth feels like when it finally breaks through the walls. Jasmine glanced once at the gallery, at the young interns in suits too large for them, at the law students whose hands had stopped taking notes, at the journalists who had come seeking drama and found history. Then she looked up, past the empty chairs, past the flag, toward the inscription carved above the bench. Equal justice under law. And for the first time all day, she allowed herself a faint, weary smile, not of triumph, but of survival. "This institution belongs to the people," she said finally, her tone softer now, but no less commanding. And today it answered to them, not just in name, but in consequence. She stepped away from the center. No applause followed, no shouting, no spontaneous eruption, because what she had done was not performative. It was surgical. It was the removal of rot from a sacred body, painful, precise, and irreversible. As she walked toward the great doors, her figure shrinking slowly beneath the towering marble columns, some of those in the gallery stood. Not because they were instructed to, but because instinctively they knew they were witnessing a transfer of something elemental: ownership, truth, responsibility, a restoration. She didn't turn around, because the work was never in the turning, it was in the facing forward. The doors closed behind Jasmine Crockett, but their echo did not fade. It ricocheted across the nation like a crack in glass that refused to stop spreading. By nightfall, the footage had been replayed on every major network, dissected in frame-by-frame analysis. Social media flooded with 1,000 interpretations, 20 million shares, and hashtags that broke every trending algorithm. For the first time in modern memory, the American people had not merely witnessed political theater. They had watched a reckoning, not behind closed doors, not buried in obscure legal language, but live, public, irreversible. And it didn't stop there. The morning after the hearing, a stunned Congress convened an emergency session. The images from the courtroom, federal agents laying hands on robed justices, encrypted messages blinking on courtroom screens, Clara Miles's trembling testimony, had become more than news. They were now a constitutional alarm bell, one that no senator, regardless of party, could afford to ignore. Proposals that had languished for years, dusty, symbolic drafts calling for judicial ethics oversight, were dusted off, rewritten, and pushed into debate within 24 hours. But the air in Washington had changed. This wasn't negotiation, it was survival. No one wanted to be the next official caught ignoring the rot that had just been ripped into daylight. Senator Mark Langdon of Massachusetts stood on the Senate floor, voice heavy with history. If the highest court in our land can be used as a weapon against democracy, then democracy must have the courage to disarm it, ethically, lawfully, permanently. The Judiciary Accountability and Transparency Act, once dismissed as impossible, passed its first procedural vote by an unprecedented margin, 92-8. Within days, both chambers had begun reshaping it into binding policy. For the first time in U.S. history, Supreme Court justices would be bound to a codified code of conduct, subject to independent review panels, mandatory financial disclosures, and, most shockingly, public hearings if accusations of misconduct surfaced. But even as reforms surged forward, the country itself split along a deepening fault line. In some corners of America, there was outrage, not at the corruption, but at the exposure. Conservative commentators called it a coup cloaked in righteousness. "This is mob justice, plain and simple," one radio host barked into the microphone. "It's not about ethics, it's about ideological extermination." Others went further, claiming the hearing was orchestrated to delegitimize the court and usher in judicial socialism. Protests erupted outside the Supreme Court gates, some waving flags, others brandishing signs that read, "Roberts was framed," and "Save Barrett, save the Constitution." But for every angry chant, there were thousands of quiet, tremulous sighs of relief. Not because the corruption had been corrected overnight, but because someone had finally dared to name it. In cafes and classrooms and law firms and living rooms, Americans who had long whispered doubts about the integrity of their justice system now spoke them aloud, without shame. A mother in Michigan told a news crew, "I've tried for years to teach my son that justice matters, that the courts are sacred. Yesterday, I finally felt I wasn't lying." In Philadelphia, a former public defender tweeted, "I've lost too many cases I should have won, not because of facts, but because the system wasn't blind. It was bought." Jasmine Crockett didn't destroy the court. She cracked open the lie that it couldn't be touched. Opinion polls, released just 72 hours after the arrests, reflected a paradox. Trust in the court's current makeup had plummeted to a historic low, just 18%. But belief that the system could be repaired surged to 67%. Because while the arrests shattered illusions, they had also done something rare in the American psyche. They introduced accountability into a place once thought immune to it, and Jasmine Crockett, whether celebrated or vilified, became the face of that shift. Late-night hosts praised her composure, her words replayed like war cries for a democracy that had been gasping. A viral montage spread of her final line. "We did not lose the court, we reclaimed it," overlaid with archival footage of civil rights marches and protesters demanding equality outside federal buildings. It wasn't just political content, it had become cultural therapy, but the backlash was real. Threats poured in. Security around Jasmine's home was increased. Her staff fielded over 400 hate messages in 2 days. Some accused her of trying to overthrow the judiciary. Others called her a traitor. But through it all, she didn't flinch. She gave no interviews, made no appearances. When asked by a journalist if she had anything to say to the country, she replied, "Justice doesn't need commentary, it needs consequences." In private, however, she remained alert. She knew that exposure alone wasn't justice. That power has a way of regrouping, of rebranding itself in silence, waiting for public outrage to tire. She'd opened a door. Now it would take generations to walk through it. But something had shifted that could not be undone. At Columbia Law School, a third-year student stood in front of a packed seminar and said, "For the first time in my education, I believe judicial ethics isn't just theory, it's survival." In Washington, D.C., the marble steps of the court, once seen as untouchable, had become a place of reflection. Tourists stopped not just to take photos, but to ask questions. How long had it been going on? Who else knew? Could it happen again? And in a small town in Georgia, a high school civics teacher played the entire hearing for her class. She didn't give a lecture. She simply asked, "What do you think justice looks like now?" No one had a simple answer, but none of them laughed, because now they knew what justice didn't look like. It didn't look like robes immune from scrutiny, or decisions shaped in the shadows, or financial ties masked as legal reasoning. It looked like a chamber full of tension, a voice willing to rise, a truth that, once spoken, didn't fade, and a nation, bruised and bewildered, daring to believe that perhaps justice, finally, was learning to stand on its own again. But as the headlines began to blur and the shock waves rippled outward, through Congress, through classrooms, through the long corridors of public opinion, there was a deeper question rising beneath the roar. What was the cost of speaking truth to power? And who carries that cost when the cameras go dark? Because this story, despite all its grandeur and historic consequence, was never just about institutions. It was about people, about what it takes for one human being to stand in a room full of untouchables and say, without shaking, enough. It was about Jasmine Crockett, yes, but it was also about every whistleblower who went ignored, every public servant who stayed silent because they were afraid, every voice that had been taught that justice was someone else's responsibility. That illusion had been shattered now, and in its place, amid the rubble of marble decorum and mythic authority, stood something far more fragile and far more real: conscience. Jasmine Crockett had not grown up expecting to fight Supreme Court justices. She had not trained for a televised war against the most insulated power in America. She had known hunger. She had known shame. She had known the pain of being told to sit down by people who had never once stood for her. And yet, when the moment came, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, she stood anyway. That is the human lesson. That courage is not the absence of fear. It is what survives after fear has done its worst. She had been mocked, interrupted, laughed at, called delusional, called dangerous. Justice Barrett had smirked at her. Justice Roberts had dismissed her. And the room, full of smug clerks and silent colleagues, had watched, waiting for her to collapse beneath the weight of doubt. But she didn't collapse. She endured. And that endurance, that refusal to be broken even when she stood alone, is not just political, it is personal. It is the quiet fire every person carries in some corner of their soul. The part of them that remembers what fairness felt like before it was stolen, what honesty sounded like before it was filtered through spin, what truth looked like before someone rich or robed told them to forget it. In that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend democracy, she defended memory. She reminded a country drowning in noise that integrity still matters, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's dangerous. Because power is never humbled by permission. It is humbled by resistance, and resistance is always born from conscience. The arrest of two justices didn't redeem the system overnight. It didn't undo decades of bias or balance a scale that had long been tipped by wealth and access. But it gave something far more vital than resolution. It gave evidence. Evidence that justice could bleed, but still stand. That a system, no matter how rigged, could still be forced to confront itself. That truth, when spoken clearly and without apology, can pierce even the thickest armor of tradition. But perhaps the most human lesson of all was this. Jasmine didn't walk out of that hearing as a hero. She walked out exhausted. Not because she was weak, but because real courage takes something from you. It is not glamorous. It is not victorious. It is the kind of courage that leaves you wondering, late at night, if it was worth it. She would carry that doubt for the rest of her life, but she would also carry something else. The knowledge that for one sacred moment in history, when the lie threatened to become law, she chose to confront it. Not with vengeance, not with malice, but with the quiet, terrible force of truth. And that truth now belonged to everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. To every intern who filed a report no one read. To every woman told she was too emotional. To every working parent who thought the system was never meant for them. To every voter who thought their voice was too small to matter. Because Jasmine's voice had once been small too, and she had used it anyway. This is not just a story about justice. It is a story about what it means to keep going when justice seems impossible. About the grit it takes to call out betrayal inside a building designed to silence you. About the terrifying beauty of standing alone, until suddenly you're not. Because when she stood at that podium and said, "We reclaimed it," she wasn't just talking about a court. She was talking about belief in the idea that power is not sacred unless it is accountable, that institutions are not holy unless they serve the people, that democracy is not self-sustaining, it is defended every day by people who bleed, who stumble, who get up anyway. And in that, the story of Jasmine Crockett becomes more than political theater. It becomes instruction. that the soul of a nation isn't written in marble. It is written in the choices we make when the stakes are highest, when no one is watching, or worse, when everyone is. She did not save the system. She reminded it of what it was meant to be. And that reminder, as fragile and fleeting as it may feel, is how democracies endure. Not because they are perfect, but because sometimes someone steps into the fire not to burn it all down, but to light the way out. But the most dangerous silence is the one that follows truth. The hearing had ended. The arrests had been made. The headlines had burned through every screen in America. Yet in the quiet that followed, a darker question lingered, one that Jasmine Crockett herself understood better than most. Will anyone do anything with what they've seen? Because history has never been changed by exposure alone. It is changed by engagement. Exposure is the lightning flash. Engagement is the fire that must follow. And without fire, the storm passes. The system resets. The rot seals itself back in. Jasmine had lit the fuse. Yes, but that was never going to be enough. Not unless someone was willing to carry the flame. This is that moment. And it does not belong to her anymore. It belongs to everyone else. It belongs to the voter who's grown tired of cynicism, but doesn't believe their ballot matters. To the teacher who skips the chapter on judicial ethics because it's too complex. To the worker who pays taxes into a system that protects power, but rarely defends the powerless. To every parent, student, veteran, and neighbor who watched the collapse of moral authority unfold and thought, what now? This is what now. This is the turning point between spectacle and legacy. Jasmine did not fight to become the story. She fought to start one. And stories like these, ones that matter, ones that risk everything, only survive if others continue writing the next chapter. So what comes next is not a question for Congress. It's a question for you. What will you do with the truth? Will you let it settle into another cautionary tale, filed away behind scandal and statistics? Or will you turn it into action? Because make no mistake, corruption does not fear the spotlight. It fears the aftermath. It fears the citizen who doesn't move on, the community that doesn't forget, the country that doesn't forgive without accountability. That is the only force powerful enough to make justice more than a word, a force that no robe, no title, no legacy can stand against, a public that finally decides to care. Jasmine Crockett stood alone at that podium, not because others lacked passion, but because too many lacked permission. You have that permission now. You don't need to be a lawyer. You don't need a seat in Congress. You don't need to know case law or court precedent. You just need to believe that justice is worth defending, that silence is not neutrality, that indifference is not safety, and that every institution, no matter how sacred, is only as righteous as the pressure we place upon it to remain so. So let the aftermath begin with questions. Why did it take this long? How many rulings were compromised? How many voices were crushed in silence? Who benefits from our forgetting? And who suffers when we pretend this didn't happen? Because pretending is how injustice survives. It does not scream. It whispers. It wears robes and speaks Latin. It smiles behind tradition and shakes hands at luncheons. It counts on your exhaustion. It feeds on your doubt. And it survives because good people assume someone else will fight it. Don't. Don't assume someone else will hold the line. Don't assume another Jasmine is waiting in the wings. There might not be. There might only be you, your voice, your demand, your refusal. The path forward will not be comfortable. It will not be quick. Real change never is, but it will be real, and that is more than most generations are given. You have seen something rare, an unmasking of the very institution designed to interpret the soul of the Constitution. You cannot unsee it. So don't try. Don't retreat. Don't recycle this as another moment in a never-ending scroll of outrage. Let it be the place where something stopped, and something else, something harder, something braver began. Call your representatives. Demand an independent ethics tribunal for all federal judges. Support whistleblowers. Fund civic education. Challenge narratives that normalize injustice. Share this story until it reaches the ones who pretend not to hear, until the price of complicity becomes too high for even the powerful to afford. Because Jasmine didn't take on giants so we could return to sleep. She did it so we would wake up. And now that we're awake, we have only two options. Look away or step forward. And if we step forward, not with rage, but with resolve, not with chaos, but with clarity, then maybe, just maybe, we will look back on this day not as the collapse of something sacred, but the moment we finally made it sacred again. And if you're still asking whether one voice matters, remember hers. She was called dramatic. She was labeled reckless. She was dismissed as emotional. They tried to drown her in process, procedure, and polished contempt. But when the country turned its eyes to the bench that day, it was her voice they heard. Not because she was loud, but because she was right. And that is the legacy power fears most. Not rebellion, but reason. Not noise, but clarity. Jasmine Crockett stood not as a symbol, but as a standard. A reminder that truth does not need a majority to be true. It only needs to be said, clearly, fiercely, and without apology. That's what you must carry now. Because the war for justice was never meant to be won in a single hearing. It's waged every day in quiet places. When a citizen files a request, no one expects them to. When a young woman refuses to stay silent about what she saw in a judge's office. When a retired postal worker gathers signatures, not for fame, but because no one else will. These are not grand gestures. They are tectonic shifts. They are how the system bends, slowly, painfully, but inevitably, back toward fairness. And don't let anyone tell you that fight is naive. What's naive is believing corruption fixes itself. What's naive is assuming integrity will survive if it's never demanded. What's naive is thinking power ever gives back what it takes without being forced to. No, hope is not naive. Hope is brutal. It requires you to look directly at everything broken and still choose to build. That is what Jasmine did, not because she was unafraid, but because she was unwilling to live in a country where fear kept everyone quiet. So let this be the last silence you accept. Let it be the final time you tell yourself you're too small, too late, too far removed. You are not. You are standing in the exact moment history is shaped by the accumulation of ordinary people who refuse to be dismissed, who refuse to let cynicism become policy, who believe against all odds that the arc only bends if someone pulls it. You are that someone, so pull, speak, act. Because if Roberts and Barrett taught us anything, it's that unchecked power is not just dangerous, it's designed to convince you that there's nothing you can do. Jasmine Crockett proved otherwise. Now it's your turn. Don't wait for another fire to ignite the room. Be the spark. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.